Thank you. It's always lovely to be with you. In particular, having escaped from Australia's university system, and I do occasionally regret it, but it was an escape. When I was asked to do this job some years ago, these meetings, both in Melbourne and here, that I've been invited to very kindly over the years, have given me the chance to engage my mind with people who are very challenging, people who have made a habit of being prepared to think of large issues rather than the smaller issues that those who rule us would like us to contain ourselves with. And I always find it challenging to be in your presence, and even occasionally amusing. Can I just explain that without being in the least bit rude, I'm going to dash off during the next talk by Professor Fraser. I'd love to hear where he gets to, because I suspect that will challenge me over dinner. But one of my priests in Adelaide, and many of you know, Father Donald Cornelius, has just been taken from his nursing home to Flinders, not expected to live. And I said that I would go out between sessions and see him and his family at the hospital. I'll be back for dinner. Such is the life of the busy priest. Last Saturday afternoon, I was actually in the Black Township, as they're still called, of Mthensabe in South Africa. That's the Black Township of East London, between the Cape and Durban, that coast. Actually a township whose population is roughly that of Sydney, and I've watched it over the past 15 years since I first began going there and interfering with its church life. It's one of the townships where my colleague Archbishop Desmond Tutu threw his not inconsiderable weight around, and when he demanded that South African black people, having emerged from the quite horrible years of apartheid, should accept the new church with its women priests and its same-sex marriage. And people often don't realise that the two places in the Anglican world where same-sex marriage began were not the United States, Canada or New Zealand, the sort of gross, immoral countries you would expect these things to start in, but and where most Anglican problems have started, especially New Zealand. They were the first Anglican church in the world to expel a bishop for not believing in women priests. The 4 out of the 5 bishops, and this is 1978, 4 of the 5 bishops were ordaining women. The Bishop of Nelson refused to. And the only grounds on which a bishop could be removed, apart from criminal activity, which they couldn't get him on because he hadn't, was if he was canonically blind. An ancient canonical requirement of bishops is that they can see. That's so that they don't accidentally ordain someone's horse because they didn't see what it was. A very sensible provision, in fact, of medieval canon law that's still in the Anglican books. Many things are on the Anglican books that are only used by modern liberals who only believe in modernity but find the medieval prescriptions very useful. And the 4 out of 5 bishops met, and even though the Bishop of Nelson was reading his daily newspaper without the aid of glasses, declared him canonically blind and removed him from office and replaced him with somebody who would ordain women, and so New Zealand was lost to our cause for the moment. We're fighting back. And I mention that because you would expect New Zealand to have adopted the same-sex marriage cataclysm, which really undercuts the very foundations of everything that our society has stood for longer than 2,000 years. And no, the first same-sex marriage in the world took place in Fortitude Valley in the Anglican Church in Brisbane, and one Peter Hollingworth assisted in the composition of the service. And the Courier Mail gave it half a page at the time, but the rest of the world's media didn't pick the story up. possibly because it had happened in Brisbane, and it's been left to the Americans to bask in reflected glory. But I've had great trouble getting the Murdoch press to print stories of Desmond Tutu being the second one in the world, and he actually, through his General Synod, made it compulsory for Anglican priests in South Africa to conduct same-sex marriages, or they weren't allowed to remain in office. And as they were expelled, so have I travelled the length and breadth of South Africa, reinstating them in the traditional Anglican communion. And Desmond and I once had a massive standoff. The first time I went to Mtensabi was to confirm several hundred young people in one of his churches, which he had expelled the priest from, and we led a solemn procession through the town before the confirmation just to assert ourselves, complete with altar boys, about 30 of them. You never move without altar boys in South Africa. A swinging incense, cross-bearer, candles and a lot, a choir, a lot of people and me, and looking, I hope, completely in place in spite of the colour. And we asserted ourselves in this church and took it over for the night. And the next week he sent in a bulldozer and demolished it, so we couldn't use it again. And it's not the first time or the last time that I've had a church demolished on me by the Anglican Church in South Africa. In fact, last year they changed their name in their General Synod from the Church of the Province of South Africa, which actually is theologically very good, to the Anglican Church of Southern Africa, which is exactly the name that I've used for our church there. And the intention, I believe, was to take over all of our buildings, and I now have more than 90 churches in South Africa. And his problem was I was in the last stages of the process of incorporating that name beyond anyone else's ability to use it in the 11 legal jurisdictions. Even in places like the Kingdom of Lesotho, I had incorporated the name. It cost me, just for the record, $26,000 in legal fees, well worth every penny, because the last round of advertisements had already appeared in the daily press all over South Africa, saying anybody with objections, please let the Supreme Court know, and they didn't. So too late, she cried, as she waved her wooden leg, and they were about to tell them that they can't use the name. We've actually left it until now to tell them, because they've changed every church sign in South Africa, and now they're going to have to change them all back. Such is the battle that is waged, and this is the micro battle, you might say, a battle for the heart and the mind of Christianity in the Anglican world. And as that battle has gone on, and as I shared with you last year, we have been inspired to think as you would think, and indeed, dare I say, as you inspired me to think, by constantly thinking far outside what a conventional mind might dare to think. The most daring thought of all, of course, was how do we in fact protect the religion of the Anglican people, what Winston Churchill would have described as the religion of the English-speaking people. And of course Churchill was quintessentially Anglican. Two words of his come to mind to tell you just how quintessentially Anglican Churchill was. He never confronted anybody face on. That's what infuriated Hitler, of course. His insults were so oblique, it was the next morning before he realised you'd been insulted. He once at a government reception summoned the drinks waiter, and he said he had a whiskey and soda, as he always had. He, of course, had a speech impediment, as well, whiskey and soda. And in fact, he used to practice his radio broadcast during the war over and over and over so that the impediment didn't show. And people don't realise the spontaneous brilliance was actually rehearsed and frequently rehearsed in that bath he had installed underground in the Imperial War Rooms under Whitehall, where the war was actually run from. Nothing disconcerted his generals more than being summoned to see the Prime Minister in his bath of a morning, where he placed himself in order to put them off their guard But anyway, he summoned the drinks waiter and said, which did you put in first, the whiskey or the soda? And the innocent wine waiter said, oh, the whiskey, Prime Minister, the whiskey. Ah, doubtless I shall come to it sooner or later. But more significantly, he was asked whether he was a good Anglican. And he looked dismayed at the question that the reporter asked him. So the reporter prompted him, well, what is your relationship to the Church of England, Prime Minister? Well, that set him going. The answer is one of his immortal sayings. My relationship to the Church of England is that of a flying buttress to a cathedral. External but supportive. And that is precisely the role that a Prime Minister ought to have, but hardly ever has had in English history. We have dared to think outside the square, and I'll drip you little threads of this in the course of my two talks to you today. And the most daring thought of all is, what is that agency on earth which is most likely to be the cradle of our most basic philosophies, the cradle of our most basic explanations about ourselves, the custodian of the heartworks of our liturgy? Such things in the prayer book which explain Englishness as very little else has before and after Shakespeare, and not accidentally emerged at the same time. We do not presume to come before this thy table, O merciful Father. This isn't an in-your-face, modern, dare I say, Roman Mass. Lord, get on with it. This is what we want, and we want it now. The translation of the new Mass, which so offends Pope Benedict and myself, and which is desperately trying to be changed, but they're arguing over every word. And I was fascinated to follow the debate in the United States recently of the United States Catholic Bishops' Conference, because the new translation that the Pope has inserted in what is known as the Grey Book, which is the Sunday texts and the text for Holy Week of the proposed translation of the Roman Mass to replace the present vulgar one, the collects are word for word with the Book of Common Prayer. Only thee and thou has been changed to you and your, which we can let go by. And the US bishops had a debate, and almost every one of the beautiful words, they said, none of my people understand this. And so they became the only bishops' conference in the world to reject it. And the Pope's next move we expect to be interesting. And he certainly isn't going to take the rejection. And I became aware of this Grey Book recently when the new assistant bishop of Melbourne, whose consecration I attended, and who is, of course, somebody who grew up in an Anglican rectory. His father was an Anglican priest, and he, a close friend of Cardinal Pell, I might add, and Cardinal Pell was the chairman of the translation committee, so all this is no accident. He gave me the Grey Book and said, is it familiar? I said, I thought I was bringing these treasures in to the Catholic Church in a unity scheme, and you've pinched them while I'm on the way. He said, yes, but it won't do you any harm. And so fascinatingly, there is this war over Anglican language and the Anglican approach to God, which is spilled beyond Anglicanism and is seen to be something that is vital to those like George Pell, who also think deeply about the next 200 years instead of the next state election. And so that is my theme for today. And it won't surprise you that I did find an answer to the question that I pondered over, and indeed pondered over in my years at the university way back in the 1970s and early 80s. And when I was just before I was made bishop in the later 90s, 13 years ago now, I was on study leave in Oxford. I was doing more leave than study, I might add. And I was rung by my predecessor, the then Archbishop, as an American, Louis Fogg. And he said, "Come down to Rome, we've got a meeting with the Vatican. We need your help. None of us speak Italian or Latin." And, so I got the train down, and the 3 days of meetings. The traditional Anglican communion was less than 18 months old. And, you know, Rome leaves the CIA for dead. It always knows what's happening. And I say that with considerable respect, because it's not easy to know what's happening. And they would not have made the mistake about the weapons of mass destruction. They knew exactly what was there, down to the last teaspoon. And they already knew about us and wanted to talk to us. And over those 3 days in which we met with a most extraordinary Archbishop in charge of Christian unity, a man by the name of Pierre Dupré, a priest who escaped prison in occupied France during the war and fled to North Africa, where he wasn't much safer, and decided he would stay there and devote his life to converting Islamic people. And he gave his life until the mid-1960s, when Pope Paul VI plucked him out of there as being the obvious person to run Christian unity. I think of the lateral thinking that was involved in that. This wasn't some Western European liberal ecumenist. This was at the hard cutting edge of confronting what was the total antithesis of Christianity, who was put in charge of Christian unity. It's a pity that we had a wishy-washy Australian replace him, Cardinal Cassidy, who the Pope visited and very ill in hospital recently, so I won't go on about Cardinal Cassidy until he's gone to heaven, but then I will. But we met with Pierre Dupré, and over 3 days the beginnings of a plot was hatched, in which he gave us strong advice, said, "Go away and do this, and then tell us when you have." And he said an extraordinary thing, which I've come to believe, but I didn't believe then. That I have watched closely from a distance the ways of the Anglicans across the world. He said, I didn't value the Anglican tradition. I think he said the English tradition. He said, until the Pope asked me to come here, and he said, I was introduced to the Pope while he gave me instructions for my new job. He said, the Pope said an amazing thing to me. He said, when I was Cardinal Montini, I was once appointed to England as the apostolic delegate. There was no nuncio then. And while I was the apostolic delegate, I went once on the train to look at York Minster because people told me it was an historic and wonderful church. I was there and they announced evensong. So I stayed, just quietly sitting there, he said. The cardinal in the corner, you might say. And he said, and Pierre Dupré said to me almost with tears in his eyes, he said, the Pope said, I was converted to Anglicanism just sitting there. It was so wonderful. Having recognized that heritage and having made some extraordinary moves to rapprochement, only to be dashed by the Anglican side, breaking agreement after agreement as they went on their way to self-destruction. And I could tell more stories than appointing a black bishop, Archbishop of York, but I won't. But the self-destruction has been extraordinary. And the latest episode, while I was in England a week and a half ago, publication by the London Times of Rowan Williams' real feelings on same-sex marriage. 40 years ago, if a bishop had said sex within a homosexual relationship is exactly the same as sex within marriage, you would have to say that man was not only bonkers, but had lost all concept of God. And there are moments when I think Rowan has. And it doesn't come easy for an archbishop to say that, I might add. It is the throne of Augustine and the rock on which the tradition is meant to be, that is now proving to be much worse than shifting sand. It is in fact raging storm waters on which we're trying to rest. All the more important then was Pierre Dupray's words. He challenged us. He said, I'll give you 3 things to do. He said, you've got to prove to us that you can grow. We're only little, 3 countries. We're now 41. Prove that you can get on with other Christians who think like you do. He said, this battle is not on denominational lines. This battle is on philosophical lines. So prove to us that you can be friends with our people who are just as marginalized as you are. And we have. He said, I plead with you, don't have too many bishops. We haven't. Hence my globe-trotting. But then he went on to say, if you do these things and continue as you are, you may come to the realization that the only institution on this earth that can save your identity is the papacy. And that's an enormously challenging thought to an Anglican after 500 years of separation, and the separation, of course, was about identity in large part. So it has gone on, and I want to weave some of that story, which I began to tell you last year, into what I have to say. But as usual, Betty, with her inimitable conciseness, has given us a topic to weave, which is fascinating and very challenging. Is it true that at the heart of all our problems of identity, the problems we have in creating cohesive and rational societies, and I may not need to tell you, but I will anyway, that a society that is based on the equity of same-sex marriage and heterosexual marriage is possibly not erring on the side of the rational, and possibly even has no future, by definition, and is possibly incorporating into the very heart of our culture that one element which alone could destroy our future. If there is a clash at the heart of what is going on within our society, is it indeed that clash between naked power and freedom? Is there some other thing to be woven in? And I've begun with a preamble that, unlike me, is about religion. I'm always conscious of the great Archbishop Daniel Mannix of Melbourne, who came into office at the age of 49 and celebrated his 50th anniversary in office while yet he lived, and gave an interview to the ABC on television just 18 months before he died at the age of 98. He gave the interview sitting luxuriously in his home in Kew, wearing the famous tip-back beretta that he used to love, and he was asked by the interviewer in part of this hour-long interview, which is still around and worth seeing even now. He was asked about his tendency to always speak about politics, and His Grace said, yes, most of my public speeches have been about politics. And the interviewer daringly said, well, what about religion, Your Grace? I have tended to leave that to the laity. I'm not at all sure that isn't the way it ought to be. So I have daringly begun with religion, unaccustomed as I am. And I would now like to turn to this problem of power. At the heart of the political and economic system that we have inherited these past 500 or so years is the issue of power. You're all aware, I'm sure, of that extremely important work of Tawney, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, which would have been better titled Protestantism and the Rise of Capitalism. His thesis is that capitalist society was impossible without the rise of Protestantism at the Reformation, because Protestant religion changed the nature of a number of things. It changed the balance from a local community to allegedly the individual. The religion of the High Middle Ages was a religion of local communities. The Oxford History of the Early Middle Ages, one volume within the many-volume set of the Oxford History of England, which I was refreshing myself on last night and found it was just as fascinating as last time I read it, talks about the unique English way in which the bishops didn't plant parishes, nor did the Vatican. The people built churches and then let the priests fight it out who was in charge and where the money would go. And so in some parts of England you get far too many churches. Coventry had a myriad little parish churches, many of which survived the bombing around the cathedral. And nobody quite knows what to do with them because they're spaced at 100-yard intervals roughly, and they represent the fact that if you were a person of prominence, the first thing you did to save your soul was build a church. And it points out that even some larger churches were divided into zones, and each zone was given by a prominent person. And these things were not part of canon law or logic. They were part of that irrepressible religious spirit that the person had their relationship with God and would do it through their good works for God as well as people around them. And still, when you go into these churches, you'll see on the walls the fact that so-and-so, when they died, left money to be given to so many retired gentlemen or gentlewomen or whatever, orphans or something. And the act of goodness is commemorated on the walls of the churches. You seldom see clergy on the walls of English churches commemorated at all. You always see the good that people did. And this is one of the vital aspects. That the Protestant way was to make the individual responsible to God directly. And in the process, of course, change the nature of money. Instead of being a closely knit little community, the village community, as it had emerged after Magna Carta, free from the oppression of lords, kings, and other forces, where people organised themselves in an interdependent but local way. And every now and then, when the nation was under great threat, rose to national things, but quickly dissolved the national structures. Even after Waterloo, we read of the way that the armed forces trickled back to their homes, often in considerable poverty. The armies simply trickled away. We sometimes forget that it's a very modern thing to keep a standing army, and indeed not only modern, but one of our problems. And so suddenly the accumulation of individuals was made a good thing, because if you were bestowed with wealth, prosperity, power, it must mean that God loves you and you have done good things. So instead of the inner wrestling of medieval man, an inner wrestling in the attempt to die well, having lived the best one can, and within the realm of the community, gathered around one's parish church to work out some hopeful salvation. Suddenly, salvation was assured. And with that assurance came the assurance of one's behaviour. That planted within society a linkage between the religious philosophy according to which society was structured and the acquisition of wealth, especially the acquisition of private wealth. Enormously undergirded as the system of shareholding and public companies for the purposes of making more money came to be the normal way in which people invested their money. And still in the United States, you're much more likely to find somebody talking about their stocks and shares as being their prosperity than you are finding them talking about their bank balance. They still don't quite trust banks. They still have their money in public enterprises, which demand inevitably the inequality of society in which they live. And so religious philosophy evolved and has continued to evolve. And if prosperity was to be assured, several things became the inevitable consequence. In the first place, a small number of individuals became exceedingly powerful by being exceedingly prosperous. And we've alluded already today to the debate about equality and sameness. When I was doing my doctorate at the University of Adelaide, one of my colleagues published a book challenging contemporary feminists, which was a brave move for one of my colleagues who was female. And it was headed, the book is named Same Difference with a question mark. And she argued that contemporary feminism, led by Greer et al., has got it utterly wrong. In attempting to force society to treat women the same as men, it has demanded that women become more unequal. Because a woman attempting to live as a man lives in career, relationships, etc., is a woman placed at a severe disadvantage. As she argued, quite rightly I believe, that if we are to respect that fundamental equity of human beings, that is, an equal starting block, and then let our glorious inequalities flourish, if we are to give people an equal chance, you must treat women differently to men, and you must treat men differently to women, which strangely is exactly the way we'd done it for the several thousand years before. And it seemed to work reasonably well. That you can't, as Scandinavia's done, give men and women the same rights to parenting leave in the workplace, where you have massively disadvantaged the woman. We're having exactly the same debate here at the moment. if you make the acquisition of a job for women a necessity, if, for instance, your banking system will only lend for a home on the basis of 2 normal salaries and not 1, which of course was the inevitable consequence in Australia of the equal pay for women push, which of course famously resulted from the strike of tram conductresses on Melbourne's trams in the early 1980s, which caused Bob Hawke almost immediately to introduce a resolution into the Industrial Relations Commission that women, the differential that had come in with the Sunshine Harvester Award way back at the beginnings of our federation, should be scrapped immediately, and women should be paid exactly the same as a man for any job. You're aware of the fact that in Australia the Sunshine Harvester Award created the precedent that a man must be paid sufficient to support his wife and the average number of children, and that the courts were to favour the man as the breadwinner and the woman as the nurturer. Now, this was well after women had won equal rights to go to university and school and so on, so it had nothing to do with all of that, and nor did it stop somebody working, but it favoured a family base for a wage. Now, one could argue for or against that, and I will one day, but of course the famous conductress's case, which I think you're all familiar with, famous conductress's case, resulted in the question being asked by the tram conductress's head of the union, that because only men could belong to the union of the drivers, so women couldn't be promoted to be drivers at that time. So the women went on strike as conductresses in order to win the right to be drivers. And it was on the ABC's precursor of Today Tonight in Melbourne television that the head of the drivers' union, the head of the conductresses' union, had it out in a fierce debate. Unfortunately, the ABC person in the middle was one of their more willowy characters, and who quickly lost control. And the tram conductresses lady was a rather large lady, who, muscular you might say, who had clearly been carting bag loads of pennies all her life and jumping on and off trams, and the driver was a weedy little fellow, very weedy little fellow called Joe, and the sound tape of this interview still survives, I might add. And unfortunately, the lady said at one stage, "I'll call my ladies off and we'll never want to drive another tram if you can answer me one question, Joe." And Joe, unfortunately for the men of Australia, said, "I can answer anything a Sheila wants." And she said, "Well, you reckon my girls can't drive your trams? Well, when you're driving down Collins Street, just tell me what you do with your penis." To which there was no answer. And Bob Hawke clearly didn't want to answer it for any job in the country. And so on the Monday following that, he introduced a resolution of equal pay for women. And it was immediately passed. And all the awards in Australia were modified. So there was no differential. Less than 2 months later, the banks of Australia, without any collusion, I'm sure, overnight, announced that henceforth they would lend on the basis of 2 salaries, the wife and the husband. 1 year later, the median house price in Sydney had doubled, and we have never recovered from the doubling. And it is now essential, almost essential, for a young couple to provide both salaries and certify they'll go on working in order to buy a house in Australia. Such is the drive of the sameness. Treat them the same and all will be well. Treat them the same and it has been a disaster. A social and economic disaster which has transformed the nature of marriage in this country. All because of a question about how you drive a tram and with what. And yet, had we persisted in an equality argument, let us create, for the best we can, equality of opportunity, and then let individualism flourish, we might just be in a different situation now. In a situation where in New South Wales it's almost impossible for a young couple to buy a house, and where banks are lending for ever and ever longer periods, even longer than the life insurance industry would tell you those people are going to live. And of course, 40 years of compounding interest is a lot of money. And I personally, always looking for conspiracies, because I'm ceaselessly involved in conspiracies. I do believe in them. I started so many in my day. But I always see a conspiracy between the lack of numeracy in our schools. You know, it would be a disaster if you told anybody in Australia now at school age how to do compound interest, because they might work out what they owe the bank. Just as if you told people anything about our history, they might say, why aren't we like that now? And so the illiteracy of our educational system, which the Howard government tentatively tried to prod into saying we must do something about this. They don't know their history. They don't know how to do basic mathematics. They don't know how to do basic language skills such as spelling and stringing together a sentence. They don't know what an adjective is, let alone a compound sentence. And so in this ignorance and fog, we find the security that the sameness argument needs to survive. Now that is an enormous transfer of power from a family to dispose itself as it wishes, as it was once free to do, to a limitation on freedom for the sake of economic outcomes for the few. It is, I would suggest, that story of house prices and equal pay in Australia, a story seldom told, although the ABC interview was in the back of one of the politics textbooks I used to use. In fact, truth be known, I didn't care about anything in the book except the interview at the back, so it's still around. But it is precisely the same little story repeated tens of thousands of times. Has been the story of the decline of our freedoms these past 500 years or so. And a basic critique of the capitalist way and what has sent people such as Eric Butler searching for a different way of constructing our economic system. The late B.A. Santa Maria was another one who dreamed of a third way between communism and capitalism because both failed the individual. Both demanded that the individual be subjected to the power of the few, to oligarchy. Now let's examine power then for a moment. There are, in fact, two ways of looking at power. The one is the naked use of coercion in many, many forms. It might be the sort of coercion that makes people terrified of a government because they will shoot you if you do what they do not wish. The coercive power of the current government in China is a classic example of that. Far and away the greatest number of executions in the world each year, and that's only the ones we know about. I came up against this in a little way. In fact, it may have been one of the things that made my university so anxious to pay me out. But and I chaired the Human Research Ethics Committee for one of our 3 Adelaide universities. And it did considerable medical research, as all 3 universities do. And it was possible to order for medical research body organs via an organisation in Hong Kong. And it's possible to order for transplants via a similar organisation in Hong Kong, as probably you're aware. What many people were not aware is that the source of the organs was almost always executed prisoners, and the executions would be arranged to conform with the order list. And so I strongly moved, it took me several years, to cease and desist coming into Australia, organs from executions to order. This was totally irreconcilable with Australia's stated system of research ethics into human beings. In fact, it was perfectly possible, but just more inconvenient, to use the organs of those who'd given their bodies to science after death within the country. You just didn't have the convenient timetabling then. And so there were alternatives, and I don't think any research was actually harmed by insisting that we would not cooperate with that dreadful regime, which is all-powerful and which is all the more dangerous for the fact that the generation who have never known anything else are comfortable with the coercion and the prosperity that their lack of freedom has made possible. It proves yet again that most ancient of both Christian and Jewish traditions, concept of original sin. We are not actually born to do good naturally. Good has to be learned. Otherwise, we naturally do wrong, which is the whole reason we have schools, as well as families. I could point to other contemporary examples. I've an experience only last Sunday of people coming over the border from Zimbabwe in order to attend the great service we had near the border up at Petersburg, Polokwane as it now is. People who live in constant fear of violence. I experienced it 18 months ago when I did a formal trip to Zimbabwe. It was bad then, it's worse now, but it was really bad. And the ZANU-PF, the ruling party, the thugs, who police almost every town, knew that I had petrol but didn't know where. Otherwise I wouldn't be driving almost the only car left going. We'd actually smuggled a drum of petrol across the border from South Africa, hidden it in an old ruin, flown in, and then taken the priest's car that he hadn't driven for ages and collected the petrol, and we had it in his living room with a hose out the window, through which we siphoned petrol every time we needed to fill up. But I went to a town called Mutari where there were several hundred people to confirm, as there always are in Africa. I arrived at the church and there was no one there. Eventually, a small child came along to say, they're all in the town hall. They've been locked up. So I went to the town hall and there were the ZANU thugs with their machine guns holding my confirmation people and the congregation at gunpoint. The church is a threat, I was led to believe, and they certainly weren't going to let me address them on any topic, let alone what I might have addressed them on, such as freedom and government. I was, to be perfectly honest, ready for a sermon that would have made Archbishop Mannix happy. It was nearly all politics with a little bit of religion. Because people must be liberated and must be taught about freedom and goodness. So we negotiated. Eventually the women and children were allowed to be confirmed, but they kept the men as hostages. And one of them came along and listened to the sermon to see that I didn't, so I didn't. I wish I'd recorded it because it was one of my better ones, in which nothing political was mentioned, but the ZANU guy kept getting angrier and angrier. He couldn't quite pin down why I was feeling angry, because I was really only quoting our Lord. But our Lord had many things to say, such as, all power on heaven and earth is given to me. This was apparently a direct insult to the Emperor of Zimbabwe, Mr. Mugabe, who, I might add, has no trouble with petrol because his armour-plated Mercedes, a stretched armour-plated Mercedes, which he drives around in or is driven in, with police cars and then motorbikes in front, immediately behind, before the police cars and the motorbikes behind, is a little petrol tanker that drives along behind it, because it gets so little mileage to the gallon they have to keep filling it up, this Mercedes, and it's so heavy. So we confirmed them, and that was lovely, and then the men were released. They couldn't quite pin down why they were angry with us, and we had brought food in the boot of this famous car, and so we fed the people, and the children beginning to be malnourished, the tummies swelling and so on. It just goes directly to your heart to have to watch this sort of thing. And it's created by the misdeeds of government, not by any natural accident. This is Stalin's type of starvation. And next morning, we stayed the night there at the church, slept in the church. Next morning, as we drove out, along the main street of Mutari, where the people lived, these very poor houses of the black people, every single person who had been confirmed had their house set fire to by the police to teach them to be confirmed or to go to church. It makes you think, doesn't it? The naked use of fear in order to assert power. That is the power of oppression. I could give you example after example after example, but you don't need it. Which people are coerced into a certain behaviour totally against their natural instincts, totally to the demolition of their freedom, in which they become simply a scared instrument of the powerful. And I could make the parallel to any young couple in this country trying to pay off their home, who go to work out of fear, not pleasure, because the bills must be paid or they do not survive. And so in fear of their own lives, they are oppressed into a pattern of economic and family behaviour. It is often not for them to say, we're going to raise our family now, won't it be lovely? And you will be able to be the mother at home, and we'll try not to have childcare because it's really not best, and you know the story. And that possibility is not open to them because of the fear of losing all that they have. Because our house prices are artificially set, not by a true market, but by an utterly distorted market that has placed conditions on the supply of money in order to acquire property that are utterly artificial and serving the tiny minority. Now that's one form of power. I'd like to set that in your minds. We come to a closing of this consideration. Set that in your minds with an utterly different exercise of power. Very topically, the power exercised by people such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was utterly bereft of any instrument of power that could coerce anyone. He emerged from the slave camps, having miraculously lived by the strength of his own will. And we read in that marvellous account of the one-day book that he memorized while yet he was a slave. It had been a good day. He had got an extra bowl of porridge in the evening. And others who weren't as forceful had gone hungry and would not survive. Reduced to a competition between slaves for the bowl of porridge. Most humans in that environment would have their minds crushed and would emerge either terminally angry or unable to cope with the human race. He emerged prepared as a naked individual in the heart of that enormous Soviet system to confront it with nothing more than his own memory and his own ability to write. The power that comes from within the individual. There are others. I mentioned Churchill. the man who failed every subject at school, who had nothing but a total confidence in his own ability, and who rallied a nation that was more inclined to be despondent and overwhelmed by little more than the sheer force of his words. We shall fight them on the beaches. And people grouped around their wireless sets listened to every word and overcame the impossible odds that were rallied against them. Europe in subjection, and almost nothing to defend them, and the US making far too much money out of the battle to come to their aid as yet. There is within the individual the potential for great power if they can only be taught to discover it. And that's why I wouldn't criticise power as such, because I go back to those words of our Lord. All power in heaven and on earth is given to me, said Jesus. Go, therefore, and transform the world. It's rightly said that the image of the world, those medieval people just before the Reformation, was a world whose boundary weren't even the ends of Europe, but more likely to be the boundaries of their own parish. And therefore the totally unknown came naturally to them, whether the unknown was heaven or hell or the parish, the next parish. It was a world largely, if not completely, unknown. And so minds were shrunk rather than expanded. And of course, in the moment when the Spanish forces, political power, were strong enough to send forth explorers to find what was beyond the world, 1492 and all that, the world began to be expanded. And human beings began to think beyond their own ability, and indeed at the heights of the Enlightenment and the New World, people began to abandon any need for the concept of God, any need for the concept of a creator, because they were in the process of creating their own world, and human power alone was sufficient. Now, thanks perhaps to yet another great power that is sufficient to send us exploring, and recently a piece of asteroid dust was brought back to the United States. An extraordinary 20-year program of exploration, eclipsing, perhaps even bringing back bits of the moon. I have a friend that attends our cathedral in Orlando, Florida, which of course is alongside Cape Canaveral, who has a role in the driving one of the rovers that's on Mars. But he's actually given me a piece of the moon to hold in my hand. It was an extraordinary experience to hold a piece of the moon, that humans had actually managed to go and get it. But in the meanwhile, our horizons have been expanded, and scientists are once again debating how on earth all this could happen by chance, and where did it begin? And what are we to make of the extraordinary unity of design that we now glimpse at the furthermost ends of the cosmos? And again, humans are being challenged, as they have not been since the Middle Ages, with understanding the boundaries of our own thought and consciousness. And once again, the idea of God as creating power is beginning to gain favour with ordinary people who have seen the greatness that is beyond our reach to see and want to understand. And so we begin to understand as we look at galaxies thousands of light years away in extraordinary detail. And as we examine the molecular structure of dust from far beyond our own system of planets, so are we once again confronted with the idea of what power is that power? If all power in heaven and earth is given to him, then surely our social and political systems should reflect the concept of that power, rather than the concept of the power that we acquired by the few in order to coerce. A true understanding of power is an understanding of the power that the book of Genesis has in fact provoked us with. Male and female, he created them, we read. In his own image, he created them. The saints have always said that to see God, you look on the face of the poor. Mother Teresa of Calcutta famously used to put that into practice. How do you know what God is like, she was asked by the late Pope, who wrote about it in a poem, one of his last books of poetry. Just before he died, it was published. And she famously answered, I see it every day, the faces of those in the gutters of Calcutta. That is where I see God. And that is power. And so as we go on during dinner to talk about freedom, that is the idea that we need to clasp. The power of the naked individual created in the image of he whose mind is greater than anything we have been able to discover. And that in the exercise of that naked freedom, true power, in fact, is discovered that is the building blocks of the society that we, church and people, ought to be dreaming about, rather than the inexorable progress of our current system into a global economy, global political system, the global circulation of people without history or identity, whose sole function is to feed the economy of the few. If we do not wake up to where our world is headed, unless we head it differently, we are inevitably going to fulfill the prophecies of those who see the whole of humankind enslaved by the few, and the worst nightmares of science fiction will have come about because we were too afraid to think. Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry that I missed the last of the Professor's addresses because I might have come in a deadlock. But I suspect from sitting together at dinner that there's a glorious unanimity there. I once saw a photograph of Archbishop Michael Ramsey sitting next to the Queen at a state dinner, and the Archbishop is tinkering with his wine glasses, 3 of them of different heights, and talking to Her Majesty, and somebody wickedly captioned it, "The Trinity, ma'am, the Trinity. The Trinity is a glorious threesome." And indeed, Archbishop Ramsey once said those words in a sermon. In fact, I recently had an example of the Church's desperate shedding of its history. Bishop Stuart Smith, who's been a great warrior in Adelaide and sorely persecuted along the way, I might add, for his faith, now in retirement. And he rocked up in his car at my church and office in the hills and said, "I've got something for you. I only just rescued it." He goes out and opens the boot, and it's full of gold vestments embroidered with rubies, and a cope, a chasuble, the works, everything down to the last apparelled amice, things you never see now. And I said, "Where on earth did these come?" He said, "Oh, St. Peter's Cathedral was just throwing them in the bin when I drove into the yard." And I said, where did these come from? I've never seen them." He said, "No, they were made especially in the early 1960s for the visits of Lord Fisher when he was Archbishop of Canterbury. His son, of course, was the headmaster of Scotch College, and the Fishers used to visit their son. The first time an Archbishop of Canterbury had ever come to Adelaide, and when he went to the cathedral, they had nothing worthy of him, so they made these cloth of gold, ruby-encrusted vestments, and they're absolutely classically beautiful." And he said, as they were throwing them out, I said, "I know the last person in Adelaide who will appreciate that." And I've worn them on several occasions since, and indeed I'm taking them to London to wear on several occasions in friendly parishes where I'll be in October. In fact, an Australian priest who used to be Senator of Vanstone's press officer, Martin Hislop, was ordained after he left Amanda's service as a late vocation in a wonderful political operation, went as locum tenens to a 5 years left to rot church in Kingston-on-Thames, St. Luke's Kingston, and just to sort it out until it could be demolished because the diocese wanted to flog the millions of pounds worth of land that it was standing on, together with the 4-storey Edwardian vicarage, with its own large acreage of garden, beautifully maintained. So Martin set about a campaign worthy of Amanda Vanstone to save the parish and become life-tenured vicar. And the first thing he did for his first Sunday was in noting that the foundation stone had been laid by the grandmother of the current Princess Alexandra, invited the now middle-aged princess, the granddaughter, to his first service because she lived in a grace and favour house in Kingston within his parish. Well, she sat in the front row, and as he left, beretta on, best Anglo-Catholic fashion at the end of Mass, which was remarkably well attended because royalty was there, he does like this to Her Royal Highness, cocked his arm, and she walked out in procession on the priest's arm, and saying in a beautiful, well-modulated royal tone above the choir, singing the final thing, she said, "I'm so glad we've acquired a vicar who knows how to wear lace." Well, from that moment onwards, he was in the receipt of the haunches of venison from the royal shootout once a year when they cull the venison in the great park from Hampton Court and everything else. And then the diocese tried to shut it down, so he mounted a campaign because they hadn't got rid of the benefice correctly. And so he campaigned against the church commissioners, and 2 days before the commissioners were due to meet on whether this was to be restored, the benefice, in which case he would become vicar with life tenure and do what he likes forever, or it would be closed and the diocese would demolish the lot. He arranged for the princess to unveil a second foundation stone on the centenary of her grandmother having unveiled the first, and a new garden along the side of the church. She arrived in the royal rolls with crowns on the whole bit. The London Times had a photo of it on their Monday front page. On Tuesday, when the Bishop of Suffolk, technically in charge, rocked up at the Church Commissioners' meeting, the third Church Estates Commissioner, who's a priest of the Church of England, who happens to hold my licence, and as I've said to Rowan Williams, when I'm licensing your church commissioners, the game is up. But the third Church Estates Commissioner said to the Bishop of Suffolk, "Of all the parishes you wanted to pick on, why did you pick on that one?" And they proceeded to vote to restore the benefice. And usually when the bishop comes to induct the new vicar, the church is full, the bells ring, flowers, candles, the lot. Well, this bishop is under such a cloud that Martin Hislop arranged for the induction to be on a weekday evening at dusk, with only the two church wardens present in a darkened church. And shortly after that, the Bishop of Suffolk famously, as recorded in the London Times, had trouble finding the right car after a particularly brilliant diplomatic binge, and was found on the back seat of the wrong car, attempting to drive his car from the back seat, but it wasn't his, and the key didn't fit. And Martin Hislop then referred to the Canon Law Society as to whether the rules about clergy drunkenness also applied to bishops, and forced the Church of England to rule that they didn't, or they'd have to get rid of him. And so it's been a memorable brawl. I give you that as an after-dinner anecdote, but also it probably brings home almost every piece of politics that I'm about to talk about. Because freedom is the way we are closing this fascinating day. I've spoken about power. And I talked about the fact that there were two kinds of power: evil, coercive power, and that power which comes from inner strength. Now, there are also two kinds of freedom. There is the kind of freedom that was characterized in my lecturing days, when it was the policy of the politics department of the University of Adelaide, for reasons totally unfathomable, to trot out to the first-year students an example of each species of homo politicus. And so we had to produce a real live communist, which wasn't difficult. We could just go down the corridor and knock on any door. A real live conservative, we usually got Alexander Downer, and that was quite easy too. And then we would fly in once a year from Sydney, the only extant species of anarchist in Australia, the man who edited the Anarchist Weekly in Sydney, which came out usually about 6 weekly, and as one would expect, a man called Jack the Anarchist, and I never did find out, but we would usually send a tutor, Jonathan Fast, who was an American living in Australia. He found trouble re-entering the United States because he was the author of that marvellous book, Trilateralism, in which he spent 400 excellent pages being rude about the Rockefellers and their friends. And in fact, that was the original expose of the Trilateral Commission, which is a subversive mob if ever there's been one. And of course, pointing out that until the current president, no one had become a president of the United States in Eisenhower who was not first an employee of the Trilateral Commission. And he chartered the influence of this quite extraordinary institution, and for that reason felt it wasn't safe to go back. So being very American, however, we would send him to the airport to collect Jack the Anarchist, because we were almost certain that on the way from the airport to University of Adelaide, Jonathan would go round at least one corner on the wrong side of the road, being totally unused as a matter of religious principle to driving on our side of the road. And indeed, on one occasion, he got totally lost and rocketed down the Port Road on the wrong side, with Jack the Anarchist cheering him on. And anarchy is, of course, the evil use of freedom. It's that use of freedom in which individual will is used for the good of the individual to the disregard of society, or usually the good of the individual as well. That is freedom that is uninformed by law or principle. To understand freedom, we have to understand what I confess was the first lecture I would give each year to the first-year politics students, the ones that I was ruining for the feminist lecturers who would try and teach them the opposite in second and third year. And I suspect that it was my subversive first year that got me out of the place with a large bonus. But I would pose the question, which I would pose to you in all seriousness as the most basic question, the one we must be able to answer if we are to have a coherent, let alone intelligent, discussion of politics. You cannot begin to construct human society, by which I mean the ability of two or more humans to live in harmony and prosper. And politics is, after all, purely the principles by which we organize human life so we can survive. Nothing more complex than that. But you cannot begin that process until you've answered this question: what are human beings for? The communist will answer to fulfill the ends of the state to which all human activity leads and aspires. And they will use any form of force or coercion or corruption in order to ensure that the individual conforms to that end. You might know it's bonkers to be producing the 10 millionth unwanted pair of size 2 shoes, but you will produce them because that is what the state wants. And you will not apply your own freedom or your own intelligence to the problems that are rightly the state's. The fascist will often answer in the same way, which is why there was an initial concern about whether they were against each other or cooperating. And that was the heart of both Douglas and Santa Maria's explorations into a different way. The conservative, the true conservative, of course, will answer to fulfill the dignity of the individual. That I exist because I exist, and I am put here, in the words of the Penny Catechism, which is very wise in these matters, question 1, I am here to know, love, and serve God, and to be happy with him forever in heaven. In other words, I am here because there has been implanted in the whole cosmos an order of creation. And I am part of that order. And my life is to be spent discovering what I must do as a result of that order. And I am free not to do it, because unless I am free not to do it, I am not free to do it. People ponder the problem of evil, as philosophers have called it. And the problem of evil is a simple one. Why does evil happen? Because unless evil is allowed to happen, goodness cannot happen. Evil is the necessary precondition for freedom to do good, because unless you are free to do ill, you are not free to do good. And that is the precise point of the Genesis document. In his own image he created them, because God alone has that freedom to will. And that freedom has been passed down to us in primeval creation. The freedom to discover our purpose and to live towards it. Thomas Aquinas, who's I'm quite a fan of his, I confess. If I were to be asked to say which bit of Christianity I feel comfortable with, I think it's the Dominican bit, that the idea of a saint for whom a large circular section had to be cut out of the table to make room for his tummy is a very healthy form of Christianity. In fact, I was taught in seminary by those who were followers of Aquinas. I don't know if I would have survived if I'd been taught by those who followed Francis, slightly too ascetic, or indeed the Jesuits, which is from which between me and them is a great gulf fixed. But in fact, I still find myself occasionally fighting with Jesuits. But the idea of Dominicans is an entirely happy and beautiful one. When in my theological college it came the feast of Thomas Aquinas in March, we would all have collective amnesia because our professor, who's most extraordinary intellect, a man who was capable, he'd made a scale model of the Globe Theatre and had little dolls for a number of plays, including Hamlet, all done with little bits of clothing that he'd sewn. And he could do Hamlet by heart, moving the dolls where they would have been in the Globe, because he'd worked out that it took an 8-line speech to go up and appear above. And when it says appear above, so on. And it was quite remarkable. But on the Feast of Thomas Aquinas, he would bring in a book which, if ever I've been tempted to steal anything, it's that, 3 volumes. It's actually on the open shelves down at the Theological Library, now opposite the airport, at the Adelaide College of Divinity. It used to be in a locked glass case, and it's tempting me sorely. It is the first printed edition of the Summa Theologica. It was only 20 years after the Gutenberg Bible that it was printed. And in the front of the 3 volumes, Guillaume de Tocca, the editor and printer, has written a Latin life of Thomas Aquinas, about 5 pages about Thomas. And this was within a couple of centuries of his death. This is very close to the original, as close as we're going to get these days. And our professor would bring in the first volume reverently and lovingly and place it on the podium and say, "Well, boys," rather breathlessly, "and whose feast day is it today?" And there would be a conspiracy not to tell him, of course. We would eagerly volunteer the information. "Archbishop Mannix's 96th birthday, Father," and various other things, but never Aquinas. And he'd give in the end, and he'd open it up, and that lecture would be reading us the Latin life of Aquinas. Most extraordinary life. The military son. Father had a large castle. Aquin is still there, near where the Pope is taking his holiday at the moment. And they were a famous and wealthy family whose sons did not become monks or priests. They became the next generation, whose duty it was to beget the generation after that. And celibacy wasn't part of the family's equation, you understand. And so when young Thomas ran off to become a priest and hid in the monastery, his father sent half his army to bring him back, which they dutifully did. And his father locked him in the cellar, this young upper teenage person who was set on becoming a mendicant monk. And his father, to ensure the fullness of his conversion to family values, locked him in the castle cellar with a roaring log fire and one of the local prostitutes. And at this stage, our professor would become, you understand, he was a literary man and he loved drama, and he would become quite animated on the podium, because the Latin describes how Thomas grabbed a burning log from the fire and was chasing the prostitute round the room, and in Latin it was flagellabat, flagellabat, and he would lick his lips, our professor would, and say, "Oh boys, this is wonderful." And of course the screams of the prostitute eventually led to Aquinas being let go to a glorious life. And the point of this minor episode is that he went on to synthesize the rediscovered works of Aristotle on freedom, on human nature, on human purpose, which had lain unread for 1,000 years, and which were only discovered in the West because a copy happened to be in one of the great Muslim libraries, having been burnt throughout Europe way back in Constantine's day as pagan literature. And this infusion into high medieval Christianity of such concepts as freedom, individual life, and the purpose of political life, the nature of society, led to a dramatic reversal and indeed dramatic change in the direction of Christian thought, which we inherit today. The whole of Christian social teaching. And the reason that Christians in the middle of the last century, Christians like Douglas, It wasn't an occupation non-Christians were doing. It was still critically viewing the society of their time, which was a disastrous, warmongering one, that had, within living memory, had produced utter chaos and human disaster in the Great Depression, which was seeing great movements of people from Central Europe particularly to the rest of the world, as we experienced in Australia, which was recasting the nature of states. And Arthur Corwell might have got into terrible trouble for his famous one-liner. It was a one-liner produced out of the anguish of the times. You know, when he was asked about the removal from Australia of a refugee who was Chinese, and we didn't have Chinese at that stage, except around Darwin. 200 miles around Darwin was the Chinese zone in Australia. And this man was in Sydney, and he was forcibly sent back to a communist fate, which was a cruel and unprincipled thing from one point of view. But as Arthur Corwell told the Parliament when questioned about it, two Wongs don't make a white. And it's recorded in Hansard. I've looked it up to make sure it's there. And indeed it is. I'm not agreeing with him, but it's a sentiment of the age. Society was deeply disturbed by the vast movement of peoples and the disruption of societies that had not known this disruption and did not have a political system or a philosophy with which to recompose themselves, because they had lost control of those principles which Aristotle and Aquinas enunciated. And it really is to Aristotle that we look for a true concept of human freedom. It wasn't in Plato, who felt we were chained captives to great events by the gods. No, his famous image of the cave, and we are chained, staring at the back wall of the cave and cannot move our heads to see what is at the entrance. And the gods are cavorting in the field outside, and every now and then we see their shadow. The shadow of the gods making love, he says, or the shadow of the gods killing each other. And we're trying to understand the world by gazing at shadows. And there's an echo of that in that famous Christian book, The Imitation of Christ. Thomas à Kempis, no less, an English author, who pre-Thomas Aquinas, several centuries before Aquinas, cried out in his spiritual writing, The Imitation of Christ, a shadow's shadow and all life is a shadow. Echoing Plato as one did before then. Augustine had brought Plato into Christianity, not necessarily to its benefit. And Aquinas challenged that and looked to Aristotle, because Aristotle, he believed, carried that philosophy which was the precursor of the Christian way. And it is a philosophy in which his book on politics is cast on the principle of an individual's informed freedom. And he uses that phrase in Greek, informed freedom. And then goes on to use a phrase, and there's even a book on it on your bookshelf today, goes on to use that phrase which came to us through Aquinas and then through a vast array of church reflection in the last 150 years. The idea of natural law, that we are indeed able to search for and understand the meaning and purpose of our existence, and then to choose to conform our lives to that meaning and purpose, which will involve not doing what we want, which is the freedom of anarchy, but doing what we ought to do, which is the freedom of the human being. Now that is a freedom which is absolutely challenged by our global politics of this moment. It is in the first place challenged by that philosophy which my contemporaries at university would like to call postmodern. Particularly I noticed lecturers of a certain age like to call themselves postmodern because it was a half a denial of their ageing self. But if you don't know why you're here, you tend to have rather a fear of what might happen next. It's either annihilation or fire. If you have no sense of ongoing purpose, it's extremely difficult to have a confident sense of eternity. And Philip Adams is a principal agonizer over eternity because he passionately doesn't believe in it. But when his father died, he didn't particularly want to believe in annihilation. He wrote several things at that time. Now, I know because in the last time that I had the joy of being with Eric Butler at his property, a number of us were there, Eric spoke about his correspondence with Philip Adams, which I then had the chance to talk to Philip Adams about at the Constitutional Convention. Why he was there, I had no idea, but I knew why I was there. And possibly we weren't there for the same purpose. But he had corresponded and respected his opponent because it was a foeman worthy of his sword in both directions. And one of the things they corresponded about was eternity. As two men of a certain age confronting meaning and purpose in life. And it'd be a marvellous thing if that correspondence had survived and could be published. I just throw that out as a little challenge to you, and because it must be in a box somewhere, and somewhere in the garage. But and so the postmodernist, who by definition doesn't accept any of the definitions of the past, this is post-history, post-language. Language is a vehicle of oppression and must be destroyed and reconstructed. Why don't they want to teach grammar in primary school? Because it is an instrument of patriarchy, an instrument of oppression, an instrument of imperialism, and in the end, an instrument of meaning. There is an image of order and purpose in the clear construction of the English sentence, with its noun and its verb and its object. It is not a chaotic jumble of words, as you would read in postmodernist poetry. Ern Malley is an example of postmodern poetry, a great hoax, but a brilliant one, because it so cleverly captured the total absence of meaning or purpose in language. And the postmodernists who were appalled, and still are to some extent, at that linguistic hoax played in Adelaide so many years ago, Mary Martin's bookshop that some of you can remember and all that, that hoax was so damaging to the egos of the postmodernists because they praised this stuff, because it was exactly what they had set out to do and done better than they had ever achieved. The total distortion and destruction of meaning in language, the divorcing of language from meaning, because language is a vehicle of meaning. And Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, 3 fairly small books in Latin. And the latest English translation by the English Dominicans, edited by Father Gilby, yes, the same family of the gin fame. And Father Gilby also liked ocean yacht racing. As I said, a Dominican is a monk in my own image. Gin-drinking, yacht-racing monks I can put up with. Austere ones, I'm still slightly behind, I must say. But edited by Father Gilby is 39 volumes, desperately trying to translate Aquinas' packed Latin. And yet it succeeds where many languages wouldn't, because English does indeed have sufficient vocabulary and meaning to generally construct the text that Aquinas intended. But of course Aquinas was struggling in Latin because Greek has an extra tense that Latin and English don't have, the aorist. And so some of what Aristotle said can never be cast in either Latin or English. And so Aquinas struggled, and so do we. Language is a vehicle of deepest meaning, and we take it on as a people to live with us and to be passed further. But constantly do we refer back to Shakespeare, the prayer book, other great ones, because what they wrote is speaking across the centuries to us, and we are constantly rechecking the accuracy of our ideas. And only when we are part of a procession of humans who have pondered the same problem as a community can we add our little bit of further depth of meaning to what has already been achieved. The communist would say, the past is rotten. There is no good in it. But through the glorious revolution, we are aiming for a human future which will be better than this. The conservative is once there was vibrant beauty and truth in that first enormous explosion of creation. And we are going to spend the rest of history discovering what it was. It will never be as good as that, but we will come as close as we can. And so we are engaging with a past which sets us free. Our natural law is simply the sum total of everything that we have come to understand about the innermost nature and purpose of creation. And in the last 100 years, we have discovered a great deal more than we ever knew. It was Aristotle, once again, who said, one day we will understand. And he was echoing Socrates, who had given that famous lecture about a century before in this new institution, the university in Athens, that famous lecture in which he said, I look at the stars at night. My eye is incapable of understanding what they are. But one day we will understand. And then, unfortunately for him, he went on to say, and when we see the lightning and hear the thunder, the priests down the road tell us that it is the gods who are angry and warring with us. That I can tell you, one day we will discover what is thunder, and it will not be gods. And for that, of course, the priests, seizing their moment, took him to the courts and accused him of destroying the state through his blasphemy of the gods. And of course he was sentenced to drink poison and die. And there's a lovely painting in the Art Gallery of South Australia of the philosopher dropping the glass and collapsing into the arms of his crying students. I used to remind my students it was an act that at the moment I wouldn't be game to follow because they mightn't prefer to catch me. But the imagery is there, and of course Plato totally contradicted Socrates, but Aristotle picked up the threads from the little bit of writings that came to him from Socrates, and indeed in his dialogues quotes from Socrates' lecture notes, and that's all we have of Socrates. And they rubbed him out too. So much has been burnt, it's a wonder we know anything. And then he seized that idea and said, yes, indeed, one day we will find a way of discovering what the stars are. And I think of that when I get from my friend in Florida the latest pictures on my email. I've been having the series coming through of that wonderful machine that parachuted down to the North Pole of Mars and has been trying things on ever since, and beautiful sharp pictures of the ice crystals. And a little while ago I got one from one of the satellites circling Mars which has a glacier inside a crater near the North Pole. of water ice, blue, shining blue in the Martian light. One of the most dramatic and beautiful pictures I've seen. But then we have the Hubble Space Telescope, in which we are glimpsing things that Aristotle dreamed we would once glimpse, and we would know more than we do now, because we had discovered a way of discovering truth. And he saw that whole human procession, the whole of human history, as a discovery of truth, increasing and increasing because we add and we add. But of course there have been moments when we have descended consciously into darkness and anarchy, and we have lost the truth and have had to rediscover it. So Aquinas rediscovered, over 1,000 years after his death, rediscovered Aristotle's works and brought them in to the Christian tradition. And we have been labouring with them since. It's absolutely essential that we understand freedom in the context of law, and it's absolutely essential that we understand law in the context of natural law. A law which is made which is contrary to natural law, that is, to the innermost nature of things, as we now understand it, is an invalid law. And that is, in fact, the right role of religion in society, the custodian of the philosophy of life, the custodian of the meaning of things, against which the lawmakers are tested. The correct version of the separation of church and state is not to keep the bishops out at all cost, which is almost the American way. The Americans are having absolute heebie-jeebies with themselves at the moment, as they periodically do, once every 4 years at least, because some bishops have issued edicts about the candidates and their views. And the church is meant to keep out of politics because we have a separation of church and state, by which they mean the church will remain silent. Now, Mr. Rann has said the same thing to me about my activities on 5AA. Indeed. And recently some blog in Europe attacked me, being that disgraceful Archbishop who takes an active part in the media and discusses politics on the radio. They said, this is the most shameful thing an Archbishop could do. And I thought, well, I can think of a number of things I haven't done which are quite more shameful, but I'll probably be arrested. And in fact, is it? Is it, provided the bishop is in fact commenting from his own principled set of convictions, which are in harmony with the history of ideas and the history of the church expressing its ideas, surely that is exactly what he's been put there for. And a bishop who remains silent is a disgrace. So there are two views of that, and I'm still on 5AA. The church is the custodian of the principles by which freedom is exercised. Law mutes freedom. Law must mute freedom. But a good law will mute the freedom to do evil. A bad law will mute the freedom to do good. And it is a ceaseless dialogue between the custodians of the principles and those who enforce the principles. And where that dialogue is restricted, such as where religion is persecuted. Mugabe, Zimbabwe, religion is persecuted and muted. China, religion is persecuted and muted. Pakistan, I have a separate passport for going to Pakistan because I can't dress like this, so it's got a different picture of me in it, and I'm a businessman when I go to Pakistan to visit my clergy, because saying prayers and say one blesses oneself, if you don't draw the curtains and can be seen from the street, that is in fact punishable by death in Pakistan. And they do execute Christians regularly for the public practice of their faith. It's a terrible country, and we seem to have got ourselves into an alliance by mistake, but that is the way of the modern world. And so there is a constant dialogue, and there must be a constant dialogue, and we must be able to say clearly that law is evil, because it is either forcing people to do what is disrupting the harmony of goodness, or it is preventing people from doing good. Now, one of the worst groups on earth that you can give this talk to, of course, is the mob of Australians, because any country descended from a group of petty criminals is going to take a lean view of law. And I'm very conscious of that, although I would invite you to speculate on just how good Australia would be if England, instead of exporting its petty criminals and executing the great ones, had done it the other way round. And we could have had a culture in which we would clearly top the gold medal thing at the Olympics, if only we were descended from a better class of criminal. But we have a natural inclination to disregard law. Put up a speeding sign, all Australians will speed past it at least once in order to prove their freedom. Well, yes, there is that tendency in us to always be over-exuberant in the exercise of freedom. The passion for individualism, which is so powerfully symbolised, for instance, in lives like Solzhenitsyn or Mother Teresa of Calcutta, or many others. Pope John Paul II, growing up in a vicious communist regime, having experienced terrible war, triumphing in a personal way, even to the moments of his death, is an inspiration of the right use of freedom, the power of the individual to assert one's individualism and to cease to be part of a camouflaged, homogeneous whole of society. And never has that ability to passionately drive individualism been more necessary than in our world. Because it's only when one understands oneself and one's own purpose that one can, in fact, begin to construct a society around one that is in accord with that basic purpose. And there will always be a dialogue to destruction in a society that claims to be multicultural and which therefore has no single philosophy that guides it, but many philosophies which will compete one with another endlessly and be controlled so that none can triumph. And in order for that to happen, the dominant philosophy, which gave rise to the system of laws and politics, must be suppressed. And so we have the violent and vicious suppression of our own history. We cannot teach the history of England. Why would we? We're in Australia, is the argument that I've ceaselessly heard for the last 40 years. We teach Australian history, which starts with Ned Kelly and ends with Germaine Greer with very little in between. With nothing of the magnificent writings of Edmund Barton and others. The diary of Australia's second Prime Minister, writing in 1903. The Constitution we seek to develop is not for this generation, but for generations as yet unborn and unknown. May all my endeavours, O Lord, be for thy glory and not for me. Recently published diary. We've waited a long time to hear those words of one of our great founding fathers. Not for me, but for thy glory be all that I do. Generations as yet unborn and unknown. Since when has an Australian law been made with that in mind? In fact, what is in mind is usually the next election. Self-seeking, power-mongering, and utterly disregarding any profound tenets of philosophy or religion. It's a long time since we had a law that encapsulated principle alone, simply for the good of it, because it is right. There is no absolute right for the postmodern world. The idea of truth itself is anathema. The Archbishop of Canterbury, in conjunction, I might add, with the primate of the United States Anglicans, who has a degree in marine biology, and therefore when she says with Rowan, "There's my truth and your truth, and we must all go together to a deeper place," one imagines sort of gurgling in the seaweed whilst being nibbled by lobsters. There is, in fact, only one truth, and it is the truth that was in the order inculcated in the beginning. In the beginning, which are the words with which the Old Testament begins, brilliantly echoed by John at the beginning of his Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word, with a capital W, is the encapsulation of all that can ever be known, because it is the mind of the Creator. That's where freedom begins and ends, because it's really the words of Augustine of Hippo that captured that best in Christian spirituality, and words that are still on the icon whenever it's drawn of Augustine of Hippo. One of the most prolific writers, but one sentence has captured the essence of what he said. Our hearts were made for thee, O God, and they are weary till they rest in thee.